picking up where we left off. We're looking at trends in terms of reasons for the overall trend of budgets increasing in size. And our next part of this, and obviously there are some connections to these, the welfare state brings with it a lot of uncontrollable expenditures, which we also refer to, and really typically I'm more likely to refer to them as mandatory expenditures, and I think for once the rest of the world and I are in pretty much the same place, and this is going to be the most common usage you will see. But in any case, these are things that the government is legally required to spend money on, and they don't really get to set whether they do it or really how much, right? Those are statutorily set things. And within this category, entitlements are huge. Entitlements in terms of mandatory expenditures, the two biggies are Social Security and Medicare. Both of these are entitlements. And really, for any entitlement, the whole point is any person who meets the criteria for that entitlement are eligible to receive it, and therefore the government is legally required to provide that for them. So for Social Security and Medicare, when you reach a certain age, you become eligible for Medicare, you become eligible for Social Security, and the government is legally obligated to provide you those income or medical benefits. There's also in here disability benefits, which are kind of handled as part of Social Security. Those expenditures, to my knowledge, largely come out of the Social Security pool of money. I could be wrong about that. But those are the same kind of thing. If a person meets the eligibility standards for disability benefits, they are entitled to receive them, and the government is required to spend that money for them. And I highlight disability benefits partly because this, until fairly recently, was a growing area of concern for lots of reasons, but one of them was in terms of spending. Over time, the number of people receiving benefits, right, and not working was growing. As more and more of the working age population of the United States, in 25 to 54 is not the entire working age population, but those are kind of seen as people's peak working and earning years. So people in this peak range were increasingly not working due to a disability or illness. And some people were concerned that what this reflected more was persistent unemployment and giving up on seeking a job, and instead finding a physician who would document things to make them eligible for disability. And where this got to be a real concern was after the Great Recession in 2008, and the number peaks here, and there was a concern that, again, people were using disability benefits as a way to avoid continuing to look for a job if they were unemployed, or as a way to continue to get income support from the federal government that was not temporary. Because once you are disabled, if you are deemed to be permanently disabled, unable to work, you are eligible for those disability benefits indefinitely. And what was actually found is, there may have been some connection between the availability of disability benefits and people using those as a substitute for work during a stretch of time where there was high joblessness. And what we see is that after the economy really began to improve, those disability numbers came back down. And that has not been the case everywhere. This is what we want. In other rich countries, because I want to be clear that this pattern of more and more people being on disability benefits and out of the workforce was not something that was unique to the United States. Britain, in particular, has had a real budgetary difficulty as more and more of their economy, right, their gross domestic product every year is spent on benefits for people who are, the terminology is a little different there, incapacitated or disabled in Britain. And theirs has continued to go up, whereas the United States went down, and theirs has trended upwards and continues to trend upwards to the British, what is an alarming rate. And so that's the reason that we talk about that is, we think of the uncontrollable expenditures and our minds do and should go to Social Security and Medicare. But there's always the possibility that a new entitlement shows up as something that consumes a larger share of a limited budget. Related here is net interest. Now, I do want to be very careful here. Net interest is not, it's really not in there as one of those mandatory expenditures in the sense that there is a legal obligation for the U.S. to pay the interest on its debt. However, there is a practical obligation. If the U.S. were to stop paying the interest it owes people who have loaned us money, and institutions and governments that have loaned our country money, then we would be in what is called default. And when the country whose dollar is the world's reserve currency, which means, it is the currency that is seen as the good one, that is used in all kinds of international transactions. It is held as a way of storing up a country's value or wealth. If we went into default, confidence in the dollar would be shaken, the value of the dollar would likely plummet, and there would be an upheaval in the global economy and financial markets and just finances, period. So, knowing those consequences, the U.S. pays its net interest. And it pays its net interest as that net interest continues to gobble up a larger share of the budget. And the federal government's debt, the national debt, has continued to rise precipitously in my lifetime. I remember as a young child, my father was concerned when the national debt hit $4 trillion. And the U.S. debt is now approaching $39 trillion. So in just, admittedly, the largest share of my lifetime, most of my lifetime, the debt has grown by nearly 10 times, right? A tenfold increase in the size of the national debt. And as the national debt goes up, right, the amount of interest the federal government owes to its debtors goes up. And the concern is that over time, net interest is going to crowd out other parts of the budget. One of the warning signs of this came in 2024 when, for the very first time, the federal government's budget had to spend more on paying net interest than on defense. And understand that when we're talking about paying interest, we're not talking about actually making the debt smaller. Right? The debt continues to grow. We're simply talking about paying the interest that accrues on top of that debt. And so if we were to take a step back here and look at our budget, remember, the lion's share of it is already tied up in mandatory expenses. Defense spending, as we saw when we looked at, for example, the story of the F-35, defense is in some ways not quite mandatory and not quite discretionary, but closer to mandatory in the sense that it is really hard to reduce the defense budget. And in fact, the defense budget is likely to grow and to grow markedly in coming years, which means there's more and more strain on this smaller part of the budget, and that is the non-defense discretionary part of the budget, which was bigger than defense, may continue to be even as defense spending grows. That's hard to tell. But there's not much area here in what we can think of as probably truly discretionary if net interest continues to eat up a larger share of U.S. federal outlays, right, or spending. And so that is the concern. And this graph, again, overall helps us understand these different components of spending. You can see the national security state. You can see the welfare state in here. And that includes our entitlements. You can see interest. All of those things lead to a trend of the budget getting bigger. It is time for an attention check. The words to write down for this one are dachshund, as in the dog, bisque, as in the soup, and especially. I should talk about that last slide. I'd forgotten it was there because I kind of waffled on whether or not to include it. This is not something you would have to write in your notes, but I think it's important to understand that the issue of the question of increasing numbers of people on disability was not just something that was a topic of discussion in the United States. It was also an important thing in other countries, most notably Britain, where the spending on people who are not working, who are of working age but not working because of incapacity or disability, which is our way of talking about people who are eligible for disability benefits, that spending has grown in Britain, but if you notice, it did not have the same dip down that it had in the United States. There was a spike around COVID, as you might have imagined, a drop down from that, but then a resumption of the climb of that line. And so I just included that just to understand, to help students understand that this was not something that was unique to the United States. And in the United States, the issue is now no longer seen as a dangerous trend that it had been. All right, sorry to get those things out of order on you. What we're going to look at next is the budget process. And we're just going to throw all of this stuff up here at once just so you can kind of see all of the pieces. I know usually I like to keep you in nerdy suspense, but in this case, we'll just let you see it all at once. And I want you to see them all at once because these are the various actions of the budget process. And we would often think about them in this order, but in the actual process in real life, they're not necessarily in this order. So the first step, and this is the first step, Congress has to pass a budget resolution, which specifies this is going to be the federal government's total expenditure limit. To achieve spending that is within that limit, there are often requests, basically suggestions, for how different parts of the federal government might achieve savings to lower overall spending to be within that limit. The second action is authorization bills. So these are acts of Congress. These are purely within Congress, meaning they're not the same as bills that will become law. But these set out the objectives for various federal programs. It might be something like the budget of a specific federal agency or some grant program like housing and urban development grants that are given to cities like St. Joe in order to carry out various projects. But these authorization bills line out the objectives and max, right, or the cap on spending levels for each federal program. Sometimes these are used to create new programs. Sometimes they are used to change an existing program. So, I mean, understand that they sound like boring things that are just about basically spelling out what we would like a part of the government to do and how much we'll give them to do it, they can be more powerful and influential than that. Time for another attention check. Your first word is poplar, is in the tree, oxbow is in the lake, and biscuit. Again, don't worry about the spelling of any of those if you are uncertain. Back to the lecture. Yeah, the third thing, and this is really where we get to the issue of some things that get out of order. Because the politics of the budget process have become so fraught in Congress, sometimes this is kind of jumped to as a way to get around blockages, especially the use of the filibuster in the Senate. Because remember, this is that thing we've talked about before that allows a Senate majority to get around the filibuster, because only a majority is required, right, under budget reconciliation rules, and filibusters are not allowed. In this stage, authorizations are changed to match limits that were established in the budget resolution. Reconciliation, this is the part where things can mean that this is not necessarily a chronological order of how things actually work. Again, because this is sometimes used to overcome threats of the filibuster in the Senate, so that a budget can be pushed through in a timely fashion without being blocked. In terms of what it is supposed to do, kind of just as a procedural thing, this is where the authorizations, those maximum spending levels specifically, are changed so that they match the limits that were established, the total limits that were established in the budget resolution. And you can also see in practical terms what the budget reconciliation is supposed to do is take very different budgets and make them the same. Both of these, this is from the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget, or Committee for, no, that is not where that is. Sorry, I thought that might actually tell me. I sometimes forget. It's either the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget or the Center for a Responsible Federal Budget. But in any case, they are a think tank, a reputable think tank, and they, as you might guess, are concerned about the federal budget, and especially about increases in deficits in the national debt. And so they run various projections of what the House Budget Committee's resolution would be. Because remember, resolutions go through committees where they are marked up, so the budget would come out of the House Budget Committee, and that, right, projects that there could be a surplus. Again, there are some different projections about what could happen. This projection shows, based on current law, what would happen, whereas the Senate budget looked like it was on track to, as they say here in the label for the chart, increase the national debt. And so reconciliation is not, we often think about it because it's typically discussed in the news as a political tool to get around the filibuster, but it does have a very real function that would usually come after authorization bills. And it's meant to bring very different budgets into line with one another. The fourth part, after there's been budget reconciliation, is appropriation bills. Time for our next attention check. Your words are Caracas, it is in the city in Venezuela, Kilimanjaro, the mountain in Africa, and Springbok, an African ungulate, I believe. Back to the lecture. And appropriation bills are the specific things that fund the provision of money to different government programs. So you can authorize a certain level of spending, but you have to also actually authorize the disbursement of funds to those government programs. So when we talk about passing a budget, there are actually lots of resolutions and acts of Congress that get bound up in one of these. We're also going to look at the players in the budget process. If you notice up here, quick reference number 23, federal budget process and players. I'm going to be giving you a paper copy of this. So please, for the love of all things holy or unholy, as always, take your pick, do not write all of this stuff down. There's too much going on here to remember. I am never going to give you a test question where I have covered up one of these with a blank and ask you to fill in what goes here or there or anywhere else. And I just want us to understand some of the different players, because remember, the budget comes from the president's office to Congress, but it's not quite that straightforward. The agencies send their requests for money. The Office of Management and Budget works back and forth with the president to make sure that the policies that are in the budget, the things the agencies want, will have effects that the president desires and avoid consequences the president would not like to happen, such as economic impacts, need for tax increases, those kinds of things. And so there's a lot that goes on in the executive branch before the president proposes a budget. There's also back and forth between other parts of the executive branch and Congress. Agencies also present their requests for their budget to the relevant congressional committees to justify why that's the amount of money they want. And then you have all of these other committees, budget committees, the authorization committees. There are different parts that deal with different stages and actions within the budget process. Time for yet another budget check. This is going to be our Nordic-themed round. We have Helsinki, Stockholm, and Oslo. And Helsinki, Stockholm, and Oslo are your 3 words for this attention check. Back to the lecture. Remember, we've got some of our specialized congressional agencies, the Congressional Budget Office. They are the counterpart, remember, to the OMB. And they're kind of there to do their homework as well and make sure that this budget is going to do what the executive branch has said it's going to do, and with the results and consequences that Congress wants or at least can tolerate. Also in here, we have the Government Accountability Office. And they are involved kind of partly after the process to audit and monitor and evaluate what agencies do with their budgets. But they can also provide feedback to Congress, like, hey, the agency said that they were going to do this with their budget last year. They were not effective in using it, or, hey, they made really good use of the money we gave them. So the fact that they want more might be a good thing, and we might want to consider, as a Congress, you might want to consider giving it to them. So there are tons of players involved in this process, lots of arrows going lots of different directions. The last thing that we need to talk about here is the one green rectangle all by itself, and that was the interest groups. And remember, they lobby to get the president to propose things in the budget that they would like to be there. They lobby Congress to make sure Congress will go along with those things the interest groups want. And that's how we get those iron triangles between Congress and the bureaucracy and the interest groups. So even though they only show up here once with their lonely green rectangle, they're definitely not a player to overlook as you consider the grand process. But again, I will give you a paper copy of that. If there are things we need to write and add to it, we will do that, but I do not want you trying to write down any notes or copy down this bewildering diagram. So we continue to talk about the budget process. I want to explain to you that it is also a lengthy process. And based on what you've seen so far, you're probably not surprised. If the process goes even the way it is supposed to go on paper, the executive branch actually starts preparing the budget a year before they send it to Congress. Okay, so you do not present, right? You do not start formulating the 2026 budget in 2026. That starts in 2025. The example we're going to use for this is George W. Bush's 2003 budget. It was the budget that was supposed to fund the government from the 1st of October in 2002 to the 30th of September in 2003. This also helps us understand the need to front load this work. The budgets don't cover a calendar year. They cover what is called a fiscal year, which is from the beginning of October, right, in one year until the end of September in the next year. Okay, so fiscal years are just kind of their own weird thing, but they are the calendar the budget runs on. And so George W. Bush, working on this budget to fund fiscal year 2002 to 2003, sends it to Congress on the 4th of February 2002, right, after formulating it for a while. And this is when it is supposed to get to Congress, is in that first week in February. I believe it's actually supposed to be the first Monday in February. Again, that's the kind of minutia that I'm not inclined to want to fill your brain up with and make you study and memorize for tests. After Congress has sent it, remember, we've got all of the other things they need to do. The budget resolution, the authorizations, the reconciliation, the appropriation resolutions, and that's where we're going to pick up here. In order to enact this budget, Congress needed to pass a dozen distinct appropriation resolutions. You do not actually disperse funds to all of the parts of the government with a single bill. In this case, right, that's kind of what Congress tried to do. I know I just told you that that's not what they do, but as with so many things, right, how it's supposed to work and how it actually works is not always quite the same thing. So, I mean, essentially, you can think of this as a sort of omnibus bill, where all of the appropriation resolutions get repackaged into a consolidated appropriation resolution. And so they're all distinct elements within that bill, but they get packaged together. Sorry, I know it's messy and it's boring and it's hard to care about, but we do kind of need to understand it. And so Congress passes this on the 13th of 2003. So in that case, they actually got through the process in what we'd think of as a decent amount of time. We're going to continue talking about the budget process, and as you might have already guessed, based on the steps involved and all the players, it is a long process. Typically, the executive starts work on the budget about a year before they actually send it to Congress. And as our example, we're going to look at George W. Bush's 2003 budget. And as we talk about budgets and their year, understand that this is kind of its own calendar. The 2003 budget funds the government actually from the 1st of October in 2002 to the end of September in 2003. So if you're wondering how is that a 2003 budget, that is because this is what's called fiscal 2003, or the fiscal year. Other things now operate on that same calendar, but the federal government most certainly does. Okay, so budgets overlap calendar years. George W. Bush did what he was supposed to, sent it to Congress on the 4th of February in 2002. It is always supposed to happen at the beginning of February. I believe it's actually the first Monday in February of 2002, so you can check me on that. If the 4th of February 2002 is a Monday, then I've got it. Yeah, but in any case, what you need to remember is beginning of February 2002. Remember, we've got all of those other steps: the overall budget resolution, the authorization bills, reconciliation, wherever that ends up fitting in the process, and then the appropriation resolutions. And Congress is supposed to pass these as 12 separate appropriation resolutions. But just as the budget reconciliation process can kind of be used to get around other steps, right, in the budgeting process, we have an exception here. Congress actually lumped those together and passed a consolidated appropriation resolution on the 13th of February 2003. Now, be careful, as you heard 4 February and you heard 13 February, and you may think Congress was fast. But notice the difference of the year. They didn't actually pass these appropriation resolutions needed to disperse funds within this budget until we were already a third of the way through that fiscal year. If you're wondering how were they able to do this without the government simply running out of money, well, that is because Congress did what Congress has very often had to do and is likely to continue to have to do, and that is use CRs, or continuing resolutions. These are temporary resolutions that extend the funding for a government program based on its previous appropriation. Okay, so there's no increase. It just continues to maintain that program at its existing level of funding. So it's just kind of a Band-Aid to keep things going. To help us understand why we needed this for Bush's 2003 budget, it's important that we understand some things that have been happening. So the current budget process has actually existed for about 50 years. It began in the mid-1970s. During this time, there have been only 4 instances where all 12 of the appropriation bills were passed by Congress on time. And this has not happened ever since 1997. What this shows you kind of is the percentage of those appropriation resolutions that have been passed. So in these cases, you get to 1997 here. That's the last time. And since then, you can see Congress has never come close, and in some years they've not passed any of them on time. The CRs are used to keep the government functioning until the new budget can be fully agreed and the appropriation bills, the new appropriation resolutions, pass through Congress. Sometimes, you can tell, were years where nothing was getting through on time. Sometimes the government has operated simply because Congress has passed full-year continuing resolutions. The two houses, the two parties in the two houses cannot agree on changes to a budget, and so sometimes the best that we can hope for is that they are able to agree that it is better to continue funding at its existing levels than it is to have a government shutdown. Although you guys have already seen a government shutdown just recently. And right now you've got a partial government shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security because of a disagreement over appropriations. So it's just a mess. I don't want you to be too down on it, but I do also want you to understand, if you feel like the budget process is a mess and that it very rarely works, you are correct. As we wrap this up, we're going to look at budgeting in the context of democracy, and especially our theories of democracy. And those kind of act as competing perspectives on what is going to drive budgeting in democracies. We're going to start with elitism. And elitist theory is pretty straightforward. The idea here is that government spending and government revenue, especially revenue gathered through the taxing that becomes a burden on the wealthy and business interests, is going to be restrained because of the influence of wealthy individuals and powerful corporate interests, and the pressure they will put on government to preserve their wealth and their profits. Again, it's going to restrain spending and reduce revenue to reduce the tax burden on those interests. And we certainly do see pressure from the wealthy and from business interests to limit taxation, and sometimes to the extent even that you essentially face a revolt of the rich. This is something that looks to be unfolding in California. California's government is looking at imposing what they're calling a one-time wealth tax on billionaires, and as a result, you have billionaires looking at very quickly relocating themselves and their assets out of California before California's government can get a hold of them. So that threat alone that they might leave, right, might prevent the Californian government from deciding it should go after them with this one-time wealth tax. And we're going to talk about hyperpluralism next. Usually we talk about elitism, pluralism, and then hyperpluralism, but this time hyperpluralism is second, and this one is a bit more complicated. Hyperpluralist theory suggests that democracies are focused on the short term because democratic leaders want to be reelected, and it's easier to be reelected if you give stuff to people, all right, immediate benefits that they can feel between elections. And for those reasons, democracies emphasize present consumption. They want to do things like give out stimulus checks when there's an economic downturn. They want to make sure that Social Security benefits are generous, Medicare benefits are generous, spend money to help kids go to college, all of those kinds of things. And none of this is to say that those are bad things, but they are costly things. And sometimes democracies put too many resources into those forms of present consumption at the expense of investments for the future, spending on infrastructure, spending on research and development. Sometimes it might be spending on education. Right? On the one hand, we could talk about money used to subsidize student loans as something that is meant to be an immediate benefit to young people who are just reaching voting age. Right? On the other hand, you might talk about from a hyper-pluralist perspective that the old folks who want their Social Security benefits and their Medicare to be generous end up taking up too much of the budgetary pie and prevent the government from spending even more on education and training, perhaps even things focused at younger children, not just the college crowd, and that we don't put investments into those things that might lead to really good economic growth, really good returns, really good things later down the road, but don't get the investment, don't get the resources that they should, because democracies are focused on that present consumption that wins votes and makes people happy right now. And this is even true, or I would argue especially true, in rich countries. And this is certainly recent history and present events bear this out, that rich countries have, one of the reasons the debt of the United States has gone up a lot, and it's gone up for a lot of wealthy European countries, and looks like it's going to do the same thing soon in Japan, is because of their focus on present consumption instead of limiting the handouts, the goodies to people right now in order to invest in things that will bring future returns. So this is, I want to be clear, this is not, we're not talking about developing democracies where democratic leaders are trying to get voters to support them in a country that, recently wasn't a democracy and maybe isn't a rich country. Here we're talking about established, wealthy democracies that are likely to have this problem. What we see is a pattern of spending more, right, and taxing less. Which brings in a new key term. I know me throwing a key term at you this late in the game may seem strange, and there was another place this could go in the lecture, but I think to help it actually hit home, it's best if it goes here. Again, there's this trend for rich democracies to spend more and tax less. Now, all of the rich democracies, I say all, that's an overstatement, but the trend in rich democracies, rich established democracies, is to spend more on immediate benefits to the people, while at the same time taxing less. In a lot of European countries, taxes are not being cut, but benefits are being more generous, are being made more generous. In the United States, right, we perhaps have something that is likely to do more to exacerbate the growth of the national debt and the size of budget deficits, and that is a habit of spending more while taxing less. And when we talk about taxing less, what we're often talking about is tax expenditures, which sounds like some kind of leftist plot, okay, to turn tax cuts somehow into government spending. That's not what I'm trying to do here. But we do need to understand that there is this term, and it's widely accepted, especially among people who analyze these things and academics. I know that's not necessarily going to discourage people to see this as a leftist plot, me throwing academics in there, but tax expenditures is an accepted term. And the idea here is that when the government gives tax breaks that allow, say, somebody like me to file something on my taxes that gets the government to kick back some of that money that they had withheld from my check. They do this every year, right, through the educator tax credit. And every year I keep receipts for the things that I have had to buy for use in my classroom and by my students, and the government will give me back up to $300. That's a tax expenditure. That is money that I had given to the government that they would otherwise get to use for something else that they now have to spend by giving it back to me. And I understand that still a lot of students will reject that notion, and I understand where you're coming from. But it is an expenditure. It comes to me in the form of a direct deposit from the U.S. Treasury. It used to come in the form of a paper check that I took to the bank and deposited, and it was a really pretty fancy check from the U.S. Treasury. And that might make it more clear and easier to grasp as an expenditure. And so tax expenditures are a real issue. Every time we give new tax credits or tax breaks, the government is giving back money that it had collected in taxes and was meant to be used for other purposes. Pluralism, put here with a question mark, because there's kind of some uncertainty here, both in terms of outcomes and really perhaps what pluralism has to tell us about budgeting. But a pluralist might point out to you that democracies, if we stop looking at them just as democracies and we compare them to non-democracies or authoritarian regimes, then what we see is that democracies both tax their people more and spend more on their people and on other things like investments than authoritarian regimes. And even if democracies spend more, and even if we accept to some extent that the hyper-pluralists are right and that democracies have a real pressure to focus on present consumption, what some more recent studies and kind of more sophisticated studies have done to analyze the effects of democratic spending, what those studies have found is that democracy spending brings more benefits, okay, because of those public pressures, those electoral pressures on the government. For one, less spending is lost to corruption. Okay, no country has zero corruption. But democracies are less prone to corruption because corrupt leaders or leaders who are seen as allowing other people to be corrupt are likely to lose their jobs at the next election. Just as an example of this, and I know Minnesota's been in the news a lot, one of the things that happened immediately before Minnesota was in the news for what's been happening in Minneapolis was that there was evidence of fraudulent use of government benefits in Minnesota. And as a result of that incident of corruption being unearthed, or at least the accusation of corruption being made with what appears to be pretty good evidence to back up that accusation, the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, who had been Kamala Harris's vice presidential candidate in the 2024 election, he chose not to continue his bid to be reelected as Minnesota's governor. So, he just withdrew. So there is real pressure that keeps Democratic leaders accountable for corruption, and therefore we get less of it. There is, even if democracies might be short-sighted, there is more investment in human capital. And so here we've got another key term coming to us late in the game. And what human capital refers to, and there are kind of some different definitions of this, but this is generally the skills, the training, the value that citizens are able to bring to the economy. The more a person knows, the more training they have, the higher value work they can do, the more productive they are, the better the overall economy is. Part of this is also health. If a person is healthy, especially if you have early childhood health, you get children who have higher IQs, and are more present in their early schooling, so they get some of those fundamentals of math and reading early on, and that sets them on the path for the rest of their life to be more productive than they otherwise would have been. So there is more of this investment in human capital and closely related health, which pays economic dividends for democracies. Also, as we go through this, well, I do want to step back, as I overlooked something with hyperpluralism. These two quotes are meant to capture hyperpluralism. We have a quote attributed to Alexander Fraser Tytler: "A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until a majority of voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse out of the public treasury." And then relatedly, a quote attributed to Benjamin Franklin: "When the people find they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic." Now, if these quotes seem similar, they are, and there's also a lot of uncertainty as to whether either of these gentlemen made either of these quotes. But they do capture this idea that if the hyper-pluralists are right and the people can vote themselves present consumption, they're sowing the seeds of democracy or republicanism's downfall. And so this note to temper my pessimism jogged my memory that I was supposed to talk about those things. Sorry, folks. Before we get to my pessimism, how about an attention check? For this attention check, you have 4 terms: granite, tambourine, gelatin, and lime. Now we'll wrap up the lecture. And really, with my pessimism, it's not that I'm saying I agree with these quotes and the men who perhaps made them, but a lot of what I have told you sounds pretty pessimistic. The debt is growing, deficits are growing, the net interest on those debts is going to continue to crowd out spending on other things. If the hyper-pluralists are right, we will continue to make the kind of short-term, present consumption-focused decisions and policies that will only make the problem grow worse until something breaks, and breaks in a major way. And you guys are thinking, well, that sounds like the kind of gloomy thought that Dr. Brown would be going about day to day holding around in his head. And you're right. But I temper my pessimism, and I remind myself of these things too. Democracies can, when they have to, make difficult and painful policies. We don't have to go really all that far back in the grand scheme of things to see a really clear example of this. The United Kingdom at the end of World War II had to make very painful decisions. The country was out of money. It owed a lot of money to countries like the United States. its currency was under threat. Its economy was in a really bad shape. And for more than a decade after the war, the British government continued to ration what was available to people. I mean, they really tightened belts, and they really, during some of the era of the financial crisis, we talked about countries adopting austerity measures to get their government's debts under control. The British government definitely did austerity. I mean, Americans chafed under rationing during World War II. And for us, World War II was not the same thing it was for everybody else. For everybody else, World War II began in 1939, or if you were the Chinese, their side of it even earlier. For the United States, I mean, it really doesn't begin until 1942, and it's over by the summer of 1945, and then things in a lot of ways go back to normal very quickly in the United States from an economic perspective. The British carried on that kind of wartime rationing. I guess I should be clear to make sure we all understand what rationing is. Rationing means restricting how much of things people can buy. And for the British, this was a wide variety of goods that today's Americans would certainly consider as essentials. And the government of Britain strictly limited their supply in order to prevent people from spending money, to prevent the country from having to import things from other countries, right? Not as a means of trade protectionism, but simply to ensure that the British currency could survive and that the government could maintain stable finances. And to do that, they extended this painful rationing for basically another 10 years. For some things, I think it was even a little longer, in order to make that happen. And it was painful, but the British kind of adopted a mustn't grumble, mend and make do attitude, and they got through it. So it can be done. I only really have that one example to give you. There are some others. So we don't see it very often, but when necessary, it does appear that democracies can really make those difficult decisions, right, and inflict pain on voters in order to carry those decisions, those policies out. The other thing is that democracies tend to have better economic growth. And as long as a country's economic growth outpaces the growth of its debt, things can be okay. And the U.S. certainly has had strong economic growth. That is one of the things that has allowed us to continue to have large deficits and a growing national debt, is that is offset by growth in the economy. If that continues, and if that continues for other democracies, then my pessimism may well be unwarranted, and that would be awesome. So take those two facts or two arguments to temper any pessimism that I have left you with. I don't want you to be depressed or scared about the budget. I do want you to be informed, because a lot of this is going to fall on your generation, and the more you understand it, the more you can push the government to kind of get out ahead of these problems, or at least catch up to them before they get too far ahead of us. All right, I'm going to stop there, and that is the end of our lectures on budgets.